From flooding and transportation in the Low Country to tariffs to the new International African American Museum, I speak exclusively with State Senator Marlon Kimpson for a special edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores, or listen to this interview later on the iHeartRadio app. Senator Kimpson, it's so good to see you again.
Good to be with you, Quintin.
Oh, always. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I gotta go to some developing news. And this is from the Post and Courier. And it reads like this, the headline. Governor McMaster appoints former South Carolina Attorney General as interim leader of Santee Cooper. And they basically break it down, basically saying this. McMaster's decision to insert Charlie Condon as a temporary chairman of Santee Cooper comes nearly a month after lawmakers in the South Carolina Senate failed to approve Condon for the full-time full job, that is. Why did he go behind you all's back?
Well, in his view, time is of the essence. To get someone chairing that board, there are many issues that Santee Cooper will be evaluating over the next 12 months. However, his action, the governor's action, is contrary to the statute. In the statute, the Senate must give advice and consent for all appointments. Now, there are such things as recess appointments, but the chronology of events with the prior Santee Cooper board chair retiring make the statute inapplicable. In other words, in our view, and when I say our view, the Council of the Senate has advised us that the governor's actions fail to meet the muster of the statute, and therefore I'm not sure he has the power to appoint Mr. Condon during the recess. We were scheduled to have several hearings to hear testimony from Mr. Condon, and obviously him being from Charleston, I had some questions.
Right.
And I think that process needs to go forward. Doesn't mean he won't get confirmed, but there is a process, and the governor is not above the law and must follow the process. And so we'll look forward to Mr. Condon appearing before the Senate Judiciary. I'm a member of that committee, and we'll be able to ask him some questions that are on my mind.
On your mind, the questions. What more questions do you have for Charlie Condon right now?
Well, it's there is a advice and consent process. And this is a big deal because there are some who support the sale of Santee Cooper, and there are some who are against the sale. And so we have to figure out where he is on that. What I would encourage all board members to do is keep an open mind. These, as we've seen with the VC Summer debacle,
Right.
These are very important decisions, and we can't go on boards, or we can't support people who go on boards with any preconceived notion of either selling or agreeing not to sell before all the information is there. And then, of course, there are many other questions that we will ask Mr. Condon, and I think he'll, depending upon his responses, we'll make the decision whether to confirm or deny his appointment. Now, I'm one member of approximately 22, and I don't know what the will of the committee. We've done some things that always surprise me on judiciary. Judiciary is a tough committee, and we have an obligation to get to the bottom of issues and get clear and concise answers. But for the governor to ignore the statute is somewhat concerning.
Well, that brings me to my next question. Charlie Condon obviously is the former South Carolina Attorney General. Is this a conflict of interest in your mind?
No, it's not a conflict per se. he served our state. One day when I leave public office, I hope to continue to serve in some capacity. There will be questions posed to make sure that they are not conflicts, but the fact that he served in a capacity as Attorney General doesn't per se disqualify him or present a conflict of interest. There may be a conflict on other matters. Those other matters I don't know. We'll have to look at his application, see what business interest he represents, and whether or not there are any conflicts with his current representation of clients, business or otherwise.
Let me stay with utilities. This is from the state newspaper on Twitter on July 20th. It reads this: Scanner Dominion secretly offered 1,500 refunds to keep lawmakers from cutting rates. $1,500 refunds to, obviously, customers. When you hear that, where does your mind go to?
Well, they have been very public about the average refund being $1,000, and what you've just read is they were contemplating at one time $1,500. It seems as if that headline suggests that they were prepared to up the ante so that the legislature would not take action on some of the legislation we passed towards the end of the session, which essentially rolled back a significant portion of the increase charge for the VC summer construction. Dominion has been very clear. If we wiped out the provisions of the Baseload Review Act, that they would be no longer interested in moving forward with the merger. We, of course, before we left, there was legislation in the House to take away all of the 18% increase. The Senate had a different view. We thought we should take away most of it, 15%. I think now the two bodies have decided that 3% would remain intact going forward, and that was largely due to prevent a constitutional takings argument that SCANA could raise. And so in our view, we did as much as we could to prevent them from delaying future decreases in utility bills and having a pretty strong argument in some people's view. I don't know, I haven't looked at the case law to support it, but in some people's view, the takings argument would have been strong. Therefore, they could file an injunction based on a constitutional deprivation of rights, therefore delaying what we've done and potentially jeopardizing any rate rollbacks that the General Assembly enacted.
We stay in Colombia. This is another headline from the state newspaper. China, quote, stealing intellectual property for softliner plants in trade war, Graham says, meaning United States Senator Lindsey Graham. How do we get here with tariffs?
Well, I think what we're going to see is that tariffs are going to devastate our economy, whether it's tariffs enacted against China or other countries. As we see, Harley Davidson now is raising the price of liquor. As we see, BMW is threatening to cut jobs, Volvo the same.
Right.
Our ports will have some devastating impacts. No one wins in a trade war. And we are starting to see evidence of the impact to South Carolina businesses. Tariffs is really an archaic concept, and this kind of rhetoric is ill-conceived and ultimately will cost our state and our country significant jobs as a result. And so we have to be vigilant. I hope that the congressional leaders who have the voice of the president, including also the governor of South Carolina, try to reason with him, although history has shown you can't reason with the president. But I think the mere discussion of tariffs harkens back to a time that is not applicable to modern day. And this is very, very concerning, and quite frankly, our delegation ought to be outraged that this president speaks in those terms as creating trade wars with neighboring countries that we have had a good relationship with. He goes to NATO and tries to shake down leaders from across the globe. It's just not in keeping with our long-standing tradition of being cooperative, fostering a mutual relationship, recognizing the benefits that others bring to the table, whether it be resources, geographical location for us to set up military bases, or otherwise. It's not just simply a matter of money. We have gained a benefit from having good relations with our neighbors, and tariffs don't further that.
Let me talk to you more about what's going on here in the Low Country. Obviously, we're sitting here in front of the Charleston Harbor, and just recently we had a significant flooding event on Friday morning. What will Charleston look like 5 to 10 years from right now until then, in your mind?
Well, I think that we don't have to speculate much. We are seeing a tremendous flooding of our downtown. And as the sea level rises, that's going to become more of a problem. Climate change is real. It's not a myth. It's not a hoax. There are many, including this president, that do not understand the concept. But it's just not happening in Charleston. It's happening all across the country. Now, in an attempt to deal with our flooding problems, I authored a bill and had many co-sponsors. Senator Kimpson, Republican, also was one of the co-sponsors. But my proposal was to use tax dollars, the accommodations tax that is assessed on hotels and other spending by tourists, take a portion of that, not just for Charleston, but all across the state where municipalities collect this tax, and use to help fix the draining problem. Accommodations taxes for Charleston amounts to about $15 million. Now, that's not going to fix our multi-billion-dollar problem, but that will allow us to help in some way. We have to recognize as a state that nuisance flooding, sunny day flooding, is a problem. And currently, these dollars go to tourism marketing. Now, listen, Charleston I don't know that we need any more money towards marketing. We have been on the top of magazine covers around the world as being at the top of the list in terms of places to visit. But I recognize that some of the festivals, they depend on these dollars. But what good is Spoleto if you can't get to Spoleto because the streets are flooded? My proposal was amended in the House by the Chairman of Ways and Means to narrowed to the inclusion of Horry County and Charleston, to the exclusion of all the other cities and counties, and therefore many in the General Assembly didn't support because their respective jurisdiction would not be able to participate. Some view what was the amendment as a poison pill, meant to sink the bill. And that's essentially what happened, because we could not agree on the contours of the legislation, and the bill did not pass. Despite passing the Senate overwhelmingly and the House by a closer margin, we could not agree to remove that provision, which would have excluded many areas in the state and only applied to Charleston and Horry based on the level of revenues that we collect. So the people of Charleston will continue to suffer for another year until we can marshal our efforts and go back at this legislation. It would have been, at least in part, some help to ease the draining demands on our city resources.
You talk about ease, you talk about demands, you talk about flooding. When you talk about flooding, you also talk about transportation. Where's the current legislation on that in your mind?
Public transportation.
Oh yeah, I mean roads, highways,
Yeah.
public transportation as well.
So we 2 years ago we passed a 2 cents gasoline revenue enhancement. I won't call it a tax, but a revenue enhancement, and that is working. I can't tell you all the bridges and highways that are being repaved, but the Department of Transportation has been very transparent. That does not address public transportation, however. As you may recall, I authored a proviso in the budget to get $500,000 to go to Carter to put up bus shelters in District 42. I believe that people who take public transportation ought to have a sense of dignity in using the equipment that we provide on the streets, and standing in the snow and the rain waiting on the bus doesn't make you feel very dignified, and then quite frankly it's not smart. But we were also able to leverage that because the federal government matches the investment in public transportation to provide some new buses for Carter. I am a firm believer that as the affordability of house gets out of reach for many of the citizens in Charleston County, we must have a robust public transit system. I would like to either see a light rail or a rapid, they call it a BRT, rapid bus system. We have to start thinking that those gasoline tax dollars be greater allocated into infrastructure so that we can increase and modernize our entire system. Imagine if you could get from Columbia to Charleston in half the time because you're on a monorail or some type of rapid transportation system, or even more importantly to the low country from Somerville to Charleston in a matter of minutes during rush hour traffic. That's smart. But unfortunately, the conservatives who've controlled our government for decades, and I'm speaking specifically about the Republicans, they don't view public transportation as a core function of government. In their view, people have cars, let them get to work. We must allocate a substantial amount of our resources to public transportation because that puts less burden on our roads. So imagine if you had a dignified and dependable, reliable transportation, you probably wouldn't drive in your household 3 cars a day to work. That puts less wear and tear on the streets and all of the accounting associated with the maintenance of our streets and our highways and our bridges. Most forward-thinking cities and counties and states invest in public transit. You can leverage those dollars with the federal government and have a robust system. Just as we invested in our ports, and it was a good thing that we did because we're going to be importing and exporting more if these tariffs don't hurt us too much. I think an equal emphasis ought to be placed not just on our ports, which I support, but also on our public transportation system.
If I were to come to you for Quintin's close-ups in the next 6 months, what would you tell me about the progress of the International African American Museum?
Oh, I'm optimistic about the progress. As you see, Michael Moore,
Right.
He has been a really lightning rod across the country. And Mayor Riley, I give it to him, he has gone in every hamlet and village and asked them for money, and people seem to be responding.
Right.
So I'm optimistic about the project, and it's so encouraging to see the corporate level of participation that we're seeing every day in the newspaper. I read another $250,000 gift, $500,000 gifts, and these are big charitable organizations, private industry, and that makes the project less dependent on what we do in the General Assembly. Now, as you know, I've been one of the leading advocates for the state honoring its commitment to $25 million. I think we're at 10 or 12 million, so we're far less than what was originally committed to. But to be sure, as I talked about the majority, the Republicans, we have not been able to get any more money in the last 2 years for the museum. I have had some private talks that I can't really reveal at the moment, but just suffice it to say, I'm optimistic that they'll break ground in a very timely manner because of some potential infusion of capital on the way.
And that brings me to my next question. Why the politics when you think of history?
Well, unfortunately, politics are politics and a major part of the State House. Some of the conservatives, not so much in the low country as in the upstate, again, the Republicans control and have controlled our state government for decades. They don't believe the project is popular in their respective districts. And in this day and age where things have been reduced to sound bites, really a bunch of nothing, you can say anything, in their view it's harder to explain why the state would allocate significant resources to the building of a museum. And so they have struggled with that and really provided every excuse not to do it. Now, we do have budget demands. Right. We were just now returning to the levels of 2008 for our funding of mental health. Right. But we can do several things at once. We just have to make this a priority, and quite frankly, it's an economic boom. When you do the math, our investment will one of the ways they measure alpha is return on investment. That's what all the investment people use. What your ROE is, return on equity. Right. And I think based on my conversations with Michael Moore, the return on our investment in terms of major boost in tourism, more businesses related to African American history, shows, tour guides, and the like, restaurants that have an influence on African American culture. All of those things will be byproducts of the museum. And so our state has an opportunity to get a return on the investment. It's not a giveaway, but some of the conservatives would couch it as such.
Let me return you to the General Assembly. Mm-hmm. When you return in January, what's that one bill that you're focused on right now in your mind?
Well, I got a lot of work to do. I'm retooling. I threw some Hail Marys towards the end of the session, the A-tax being one of them. That will be a priority. I also will be monitoring. I was the author of the internet sales tax collection.
Right.
Now, that's not necessarily politically popular, but the fact is that most of our neighboring states have required people who purchase items off the internet to collect the sales tax associated for the state on those items. Commerce has changed, and if our tax laws don't keep up, there was a time where everybody went to the brick and mortar store and purchase goods. Now what they do is go to the brick and mortar store, ask the salespeople what the size is, how does this wear, can I try it, car seat in my car, and then they will go out and buy that same item on the internet, therefore utilizing the staff employees of another store, but purchasing off the internet to avoid sales tax. Under the latest decision, the Wayfair decision, but quite frankly, Wayfair clarified Quill, which essentially stood for the proposition that if a company on the internet markets and targets South Carolinians, which they do, you pull up any of the local websites, you got all these internet ads for products, that constitutes a nexus and gives us the authority to require that internet retailer to collect our sales taxes. The brick and mortar stores are at a competitive disadvantage because people use them to try on the product, to get sales advice, But in order to escape sales tax, they go buy on the internet. Our brick and mortar stores are closing. Those stores contributed greatly to our economy. And so what this does is level the playing field. Now, why is that a priority of mine? According to many estimates I've received, we stand to collect about 300 to 400 million. I know that's a big gap, but the estimates were all over the place. We can use that to increase teacher pay. We can use that to fund our schools in the corridor of shame. If the problem is resources, which I believe that they are, to do many of these things that we've talked about today, increase mental health funding, increase the funding of our education system, our public transit system, we're going to have to identify new sources of revenue. And the thing about this internet sales tax, it's really not a new sales tax. It's not new. Under the existing statute, people are required to self-report purchases on the internet and tender the appropriate tax. But because DOR, the Department of Revenue, lacks the ability to enforce it and collect it, they don't do it. So very few people self-report and tender the tax. All we're doing, this is another tool to level the playing field and allow DOR to do directly what they lack the resources to do in the past.
State Senator Marlon Kimpson, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate this.
I appreciate you giving me this opportunity.
Anytime.
Good.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you.